A nerve runs through you that controls everything. The ancients discovered it before any brain scan existed. Modern science finally proved what Stoics always knew. The inner citadel. At the inner citadel, we investigate where ancient wisdom meets modern neuroscience to forge unshakable minds. We combine Jungian analytical psychology with Stoic philosophy and cutting-edge brain research to decode the human psyche. The vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve in your entire body, stretching from brainstem to gut. It controls your heartbeat, your breathing, your digestion, and most critically, your emotional state. What follows is philosophical and psychological exploration, and is never a substitute for professional mental health treatment. This documentary examines ideas at the intersection of philosophy and neuroscience, and is not clinical advice. If you are struggling with anxiety or depression, please seek guidance from a qualified professional first. In 1895, German physiologists first mapped the vagus nerve's complete pathway through the human body. But 2,000 years earlier, Marcus Aurelius was already training the same neural pathway every single night. His evening practice of self-examination, described in the Meditations, activated parasympathetic calming responses. Neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Huberman confirmed in 2024 that deliberate slow exhaling directly stimulates vagal tone. The Stoics practiced what they called the evening review, a systematic examination of the day's emotional responses. This practice forced the prefrontal cortex to override the amygdala's residual fear signals from the day. Research published in Nature Neuroscience shows cognitive reappraisal physically strengthens prefrontal amygdala connections over time. Every time Aurelius wrote in his journal, he was performing what neuroscience calls top-down emotional regulation. The prefrontal cortex sends inhibitory signals downward through the vagus nerve to calm the entire body. This is the biological mechanism behind what Epictetus meant when he said it is not things that disturb us. He understood that our judgments about events create our suffering, not the events themselves. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy built its entire framework on this exact Stoic principle of cognitive reappraisal. Dr. Aaron Beck, the founder of CBT, explicitly acknowledged his debt to Epictetus and Stoic philosophy. When you reframe a threatening thought, your vagus nerve immediately shifts your body from fight or flight to rest and digest. Stephen Porges introduced polyvagal theory in 1994, fundamentally changing how we understand the autonomic nervous system. He proposed that the vagus nerve operates on 3 hierarchical levels, each governing a different survival response. The ventral vagal state enables social engagement, calm connection, and the feeling of safety in your body. The sympathetic state triggers mobilization, the ancient fight-or-flight response that floods your body with cortisol. The dorsal vagal state produces complete shutdown collapse and the frozen numbness of overwhelming helplessness. The Stoics were training themselves to remain in the ventral vagal state through deliberate philosophical practice. Carl Jung understood something the Stoics did not fully articulate about the unconscious dimensions of emotional regulation. Jung proposed that the psyche contains a shadow, the repressed unconscious aspects of personality that we refuse to acknowledge. What Jung could not have known is that shadow material literally lives in your autonomic nervous system. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk demonstrated in the body keeps the score that repressed trauma is stored somatically. Unprocessed emotions create chronic vagal dysregulation, keeping your nervous system locked in survival mode permanently. This means Jung's shadow is not merely a metaphor for psychological darkness, it is measurable biological dysfunction. Consider this possibility carefully, because it reframes the entire project of self-knowledge in biological terms. The individuation process that Jung described as the central task of human life requires nervous system integration. You cannot integrate your shadow while your vagus nerve keeps your body in chronic sympathetic activation. The examined life that Socrates demanded begins not in the mind alone, but in the body's deepest wiring. Seneca wrote extensively about the practice of voluntary discomfort as training for psychological resilience. Cold exposure research by Dr. Susanna Soberg shows deliberate cold activates the vagus nerve within seconds. Seneca could not have known the neuroscience, but his prescription was biologically precise for vagal activation. The transformation begins when you understand that emotional resilience is a trainable biological skill, not a character trait. Neuroplasticity research from Harvard Medical School confirms the brain physically reshapes itself through repeated practice. 8 weeks of consistent meditation practice produces measurable increases in cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, physically shrinks in volume after sustained mindfulness training. This is what the Stoics call the inner citadel, the fortress of the mind that no external force can penetrate. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts, and every thought shapes your neural architecture. Jung warned that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in conscious life, the darker it grows. The shadow contains not only darkness, but also undeveloped potential and unlived creative energy waiting for integration. When shadow material remains unconscious, it hijacks the autonomic nervous system, creating unexplained anxiety and chronic tension. Polyvagal theory explains this precisely as neurosption, the unconscious detection of threat that bypasses conscious awareness. Your body detects danger before your conscious mind even registers what triggered the alarm response. Jung's concept of the archetype maps remarkably well onto what neuroscience calls implicit emotional memory networks. These deep patterns inherited through evolution operate beneath conscious awareness, driving our emotional responses automatically. The persona, the social mask Jung described, operates through the ventral vagal complex, managing social engagement behaviors. When the persona cracks under stress, the sympathetic nervous system floods the body with cortisol and adrenaline instantly. Shadow integration therefore requires restoring vagal tone, first creating biological safety, before psychological excavation begins. This is perhaps the most important awakening in modern psychology, understanding that the body must feel safe before the mind can heal. Epictetus taught his students the dichotomy of control, distinguishing between what depends on us and what does not. Neuroimaging studies reveal this distinction, activates the default mode network, reducing rumination and anxiety loops. When you mentally categorize a stressor as outside your control, your amygdala activation measurably decreases within seconds. This is not passive resignation, but active cognitive liberation, freeing neural resources for what you can actually influence. The Stoics called this practice the discipline of desire, training yourself to want only what nature provides. Functional MRI studies show practiced meditators have reduced activity in brain regions associated with craving and attachment. The anterior cingulate cortex strengthens through this practice, becoming a more effective mediator between emotion and reason. Pause here and consider your own nervous system state right now as you absorb these ideas about ancient wisdom. Are you breathing shallowly or deeply right now? Because that single distinction reveals your current vagal tone. This mirror moment is itself a Stoic exercise, turning awareness inward to observe the state of your own psyche. The view from above was Marcus Aurelius's favorite meditation technique for gaining perspective on human affairs. Neuroscience calls this cognitive distancing, and it activates the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, reducing emotional intensity immediately. When you mentally zoom out from your problems, your vagus nerve shifts toward parasympathetic dominance, restoring calm. A 2023 study in Psychological Science confirmed that self-distancing reduces cortisol levels by up to 40%. The Stoics were performing evidence-based stress reduction techniques 2 millennia before the evidence existed. Heart rate variability is the gold standard measure of vagal tone, and it predicts emotional resilience with remarkable accuracy. Higher heart rate variability correlates with better emotional regulation, greater cognitive flexibility, and stronger immune function. People with high vagal tone recover from stress faster, demonstrate more empathy, and maintain clearer thinking under pressure. This is precisely the psychological profile that Stoic philosophy aimed to cultivate in its practitioners throughout history. The discipline of assent, Epictetus taught, involves pausing before reacting to any impression that strikes the mind. This pause activates the anterior insula, creating a gap between stimulus and response, where conscious choice can operate. Viktor Frankl echoed this in Man's Search for Meaning, stating between stimulus and response there is a space. In that sacred space lies your freedom to choose your response, and that choice is mediated by your vagus nerve. Research at the University of Wisconsin found that experienced meditators show 40% faster emotional recovery after stress. The Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum involves deliberately visualizing worst-case scenarios before they occur. This sounds counterintuitive, but neuroscience reveals it is one of the most powerful anxiety reduction techniques ever discovered. When you pre-experience a feared outcome in imagination, the amygdala gradually habituates, reducing its threat response. Exposure therapy, the gold standard treatment for anxiety disorders, uses this exact same neurobiological principle. Seneca instructed his students to rehearse poverty, loss, and death, not from morbidity, but from strategic psychological preparation. Each rehearsal strengthened prefrontal inhibitory circuits, making the practitioner less reactive to actual adversity when it arrived. Brain imaging from Yale University shows premeditatio practitioners develop denser white matter tracts connecting frontal and limbic regions. The vagus nerve serves as the primary conduit for these calming signals traveling from brain to body. When vagal tone is high, your heart rate slows, your digestion normalizes, and your inflammatory markers decrease measurably. This biological calm is the physical foundation of what the Stoics called ataraxia, perfect tranquility of the soul. But we must be honest about the limitations of applying ancient philosophy to modern psychological suffering. Stoicism alone cannot address clinical depression, post-traumatic stress, or severe anxiety disorders, and this distinction matters profoundly. Philosophy provides frameworks for the examined life, but clinical conditions require clinical intervention from trained professionals. The default mode network operates during rest and self-reflection, and it is precisely where Stoic journaling does its deepest work. When you journal your thoughts, you engage the default mode network, while simultaneously activating executive control regions. This dual activation creates what researchers call flow states, where self-awareness and focused attention coexist productively. Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations, never intending publication, making them perhaps history's most authentic psychological document. He was essentially performing cognitive behavioral therapy on himself 19 centuries before the technique had a name. The integration of body and mind that both Stoicism and Jungian psychology demand finds its biological substrate in the vagus nerve. When Jung spoke of individuation becoming whole, he was describing a process that requires nervous system coherence. The fragmented psyche cannot integrate when the autonomic nervous system remains stuck in defensive survival patterns. Vagal toning exercises create the biological preconditions for deep psychological work to actually take root and transform. Consider what this means for your own psychological practice. Every breathing exercise is shadow work preparation. The Stoic morning preparation ritual involved anticipating the day's challenges and predeciding emotional responses to each one. This practice preactivates prefrontal control circuits, essentially warming up the brain's executive function before the day begins. Dr. Richard Davidson's research at the Center for Healthy Minds demonstrates that compassion meditation increases vagal tone significantly. The Stoics practiced oikiosis, the expanding circle of concern from self to family, to community, to all humanity. This expanding compassion directly stimulates the ventral vagal complex, enhancing social bonding and emotional safety simultaneously. Here is one actionable practice you can begin tonight that bridges Stoic philosophy and vagal nerve science directly. Spend 5 minutes each evening performing the Stoic evening review while breathing with extended exhales twice as long as inhales. Review 3 events from your day, and for each one practice cognitive reappraisal, asking, "What was in my control?" This combines top-down cognitive regulation with bottom-up vagal stimulation, creating the most effective neural training possible. After 8 weeks of this practice, research suggests you will show measurable improvements in heart rate variability. The ancient Stoics built fortresses of the mind, and now we understand those fortresses had biological foundations in the vagus nerve. Your inner citadel is not a metaphor but a trainable neurobiological reality, waiting for your deliberate cultivation. Begin tonight and let the ancient wisdom rewire the nerve that controls your deepest capacity for peace.